My name is Hussein Askary. I'm a native of Iraq, but I've been living in Sweden many years. I work in Sweden for the Schiller Institute and Executive Intelligence Review. Being from Iraq, since I was born in 1968, I've gone through many wars and revolts and civil wars and international wars and sanctions and all kinds of things, both living there but also being. But we have, as His Excellency said, that people in Libya, they were happy to get rid of Gaddafi as a dictator, but then now they have to deal with the next problem. And this is exactly what the problem is. Because what we have seen in Africa, for example, you change a government, you have a military coup, then the next group becomes the next dictator, and then they will have to do something to take out this next dictator, and you use the resources and the economy and the human resources in a continuous upheaval and revolts and coups and counter-coups which never end. The problem is that what we have seen with Libya and now with Syria and even with Iraq before, that there's a very dangerous process going on. We call it the Tony Blair doctrine. Tony Blair in 1999, he gave a speech in the University of Chicago, and he said that the idea of the perfect sovereignty of nations, that has to be reviewed, because that does not really apply to our modern times. And if you know that the principle of the perfect sovereignty and independence of nations is one of the most important principles in the United Nations Charter, and actually this was gained by enormous sacrifice, especially by people in Europe, after the 100 years religious wars, the 30 years war, and that was ended with the Peace of Westphalia in Europe, because leaders in Europe realized by the end of the 30 years war in 1648, they said, this religious war is not going to end. We will destroy everyone, ourselves and our neighbors and everyone. And some wise people, including religious people and philosophers, they came up with the idea that that the nations should have the right to their own religion, that another nation has not the right to determine what the people inside the neighboring nation, what kind of religion they follow, what kind of norms they have, and that nations should be independent. But what a nation's role is to help your neighbor is to work for the benefit of your neighbor. That's in the Peace of Westphalia, that nations are independent, but nations should work together to improve their neighbors' living conditions. That's the best way you can protect yourself, is by helping your neighbor to have peace and development. And these became part of the United Nations Charter. Now, Tony Blair says, no, there's a new world order here. There are dictators, there are bad guys, and so on. And remember, it was Tony Blair who rehabilitated Gaddafi in the famous meeting at the Gaddafi tent in 2004. After Saddam Hussein was hanged, Gaddafi decided that it's not a good time to continue being the bad boy. And he gave up the chemical weapons program. And then Tony Blair came back to Libya. He was the first head of state, foreign head of state, and signed these deals with Gaddafi, where Gaddafi was made a nice guy again. And then they tried to make Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, his son, as the crown prince, and he was given a phony economics degree from the London School of Economics. The idea was that Libya will be transformed into a free market, liberal economy, and we will not have to hang Gaddafi or anything. We can just replace him with his son, and the wealth of Libya will be invested in foreign banks, as they did through the Libya Fund or the Libya. And then they signed all these kinds of deals where Libya took the guilt for the Lockerbie bombing, and the Libyan dictator suddenly became, or the terrorist, he became the nice guy. He became a friend of Europe, Berlusconi. All these dictators before they were overthrown, were friends of Europe. And they were the perfect ones who implemented the IMF and World Bank policy. In October 2010, a World Bank report came out and said the two most growing economies in Africa were Tunisia and Libya. And it's based on these strange criteria which the World Bank and IMF have, what they're doing now in Greece, is that based on their estimates, these countries are the most developing countries because they're implementing this liberal free market economy where the cheap labor of the country is being used by foreign companies in offshore companies, and the economy of the country is not affected. The revolt in Tunisia and Egypt was a revolt. Of course, these were dictators, but it was also a revolt against the injustice, social and economic injustice, where young people fight hard to get education for about 20 years, but they realize the moment they come out of university as engineer or anything, there's no job. They have to take a boat to Europe, maybe they survive or not, but that's the only chance they have. And it was the economic policies which were supported by the EU, by the United States, which destroyed the economy of Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. And that is not being solved. People who say this is a revolution needs ideas. Because any revolution, any war, which does not entitle rebuilding the nation's economy and granting people the best possible living conditions, education for children, a decent healthcare system, and an idea of what to do with the future of that nation, that's not really a revolution. So the problem now we have, the Blair doctrine is standing against not only international law and the lessons of history, but we have what we call the Putin doctrine, which that's why we have this crisis in Syria, because I think the Russians and the Chinese are correct. Their argument to the United Nations Security Council is that if we breach the principle of the perfect sovereignty and independence of nations, then we are stepping into an era of barbarity, where the powerful nations give themselves the right to destroy the smaller nations and interfere in their policies. We will create a barbaric world, or what we can call a social Darwinistic world order. So we have to protect the sovereignty of nations, but what we can do instead, as the people who fought to get the Peace of Westphalia in Europe, is that we have to work for the benefit of the other. That should be our priority. And the best way to do it is by getting economic cooperation among nations. There are problems, political problems. I mean, people don't like political leaders. I mean, we have problems with our political leaders in Sweden. You know, Denmark, you know, people don't like politicians, people don't like governments, because in the last 30, 40 years, they have not been working for development and economic justice for people. So, but the way to do these things is not by launching wars and having regime change and asking for foreign assistance to destroy your own country. What you have to do is that you can gradually build a trust among nations. You help other nations develop economically, you create an educated middle class, and so on and so forth. Now the problem is, most of these local dictators are part of a global policy. You know, I don't want to go through all the details about Saddam Hussein, because they were serving a certain international policy. The reason they were in power is that they were helping someone else, a superpower, either in the East or in the West or somewhere, to run the region for them. So as Tom said, if we don't have a paradigm shift in the policies of the United States and Europe towards away from this liberal free market imperialist economy into an orientation for real economic development, social development, and then from there we can offer that to other nations. It's like you could solve the problem with Iran, you have to build trust with Iran. I mean, the Iranians, if you threaten the Iranians every day of the week, how do you expect them to cooperate with you? You have to offer Iran something which they cannot say no to. You can offer Iran assistance in the providing nuclear technology, for example, because Iran has decided and it has the right to have nuclear technology. Many nations in Europe have that. Why not the Iranians? We can build bridges of trust with other nations by telling them, look, we can help you, but we need to know that your intentions are not bad. And therefore, I mean, like the Russians do in Iran or in Syria, they go into the inside of the country by helping that country, but then they have an idea of what those people are doing. And that's where you can have a totally different approach to that. So I think going to the theme of my presentation, in November, Mrs. Helge Sepp-LaRouche, who's the chairman of our international the Schiller Institute and a political leader in Germany, she organized intensively to have an emergency conference, which was held in Germany in November. And she invited political leaders, economists, scientists, and diplomats from basically around the world. And she said that the crisis in Syria, the escalation against Iran, the placing of the U.S. forces in the Gulf and the Arabian Sea, you know, with the nuclear submarines and so on, that we have, the tension is so high that we can any day have, by miscalculation, we can trigger a world war. So therefore we need to have an international conference to bring people together to discuss this problem, but also to present an alternative, a reasonable alternative to this mad policy. And Helge Sepp-LaRouche, she, with myself and a number of our collaborators, she said we need to present something which, instead of splitting nations, like the question of Syria because of the political and military tension, we can use the same crisis to bring nations together. So we have to do something, present something for all nations which can unite the whole world against a common enemy. And that common enemy is not another nation, it's not a leader of another nation. That common enemy is what we can show later is poverty and social injustice. We can start, I don't know if Michelle. Okay, we take it from the big picture as Tom presented. This is the Eurasian land bridge, or the world land bridge. This is one of the most elaborate infrastructure and development project ever proposed in the history of mankind. It started actually after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Schiller Institute and Mr. LaRouche, they proposed to have a Marshall Plan for Eastern Europe and Russia, and to have a policy which is called the productive triangle, to use the industrial technological potential in Central Europe to develop the rest of Eastern Europe and Russia. And then that was, of course, it did not happen because Russia was pulled into this free market liberal economy, and we know what happened with the Russian economy after that. Now they're trying to rebuild it. But the idea was then expanded into what Helge Sepp-LaRouche called the Silk Road policy. That's a new strategy to bring China, India, and Asia closer to Europe through economic development. And the idea is to rebuild the old Silk Road, which at the time of the Islamic Renaissance was bringing goods, spices, and silk from Asia to Europe and from Europe to Asia through the Southwest Asia, Central Asia, and to the Mediterranean. So this actually in 1996, this became official Chinese policy. The Chinese government convened an international conference about the Silk Road, and they announced that their intention that this will become China's policy in the coming decades. And Mrs. Helge Sepp-LaRouche was invited to that conference to present her view of that policy. And now the Chinese, we know they are building, emphatically are involved in building all kinds of infrastructure. They are working with other nations to, most of that, now it's possible to go by train from China, from Korea, from China to Holland, to even England by train. There's a complete connection. There's also a connection from the northern Siberia into Scandinavia and into Norway, and then there's a shipping line going to America. Now, this is not just train lines. These are development corridors, we call them, that they are about 50-kilometer wide. Includes railway, roads, water pipelines, canals, oil and gas pipelines, electrical, and building new cities. Now, we have this is mostly is being built, but it's not a mission for nations. You know, every nation is building a small thing. Now, we have a problem in the middle of this, which that's what we have is the common enemy we want to designate. You can take the next. This is the same map, but it has the major deserts and arid areas of the planet. We have the largest deserts, of course, is the Sahara, the Great Sahara. We have the Arabian Desert. We have in the Western China. But all these areas, this is about 13 million square kilometers. This is a huge part of our planet, which is mostly unpopulated, or it's not convenient for development and economic development and social development, although we have very big concentrations of populations in certain areas. But that this is one of the biggest problems, actually, our planet and nations are facing now. We have drought, we have the expansion of the desert, destroying agriculture, destroying whole societies. If we go to the next, take the next one. This is an image of the Lake Chad in Africa. This is how it was in 1972. Sorry, this is in 1972, and it has been shrinking intensively in the last decades. Now, this desert, it did not happen since the age of industrialization. The desert did not. This is a long-term process which started with the end of the Ice Age about 20,000 years ago. This area, the Sahara area, was a green area at the time of the Ice Age, when here in Europe we had about 2-3 kilometers ice sheet covering land. There was no life in Europe, but in these areas during the Ice Age, these areas were green areas with very mild temperatures. But since the recession of the ice and the end of the Ice Age, the changes in the temperature and climate has created this continuous process. But it's intensifying right now, becoming more because the demand for economic development, the need for water, and the population growth has made, and even wrong policies made this to accelerate even more. So we have this case of Lake Chad, which lies between Chad, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon. Many nations, millions of people have traditionally lived off agriculture and raising cattle around the Chad Lake. Now people have to move to follow the water, and that creates enormous problems for all the governments there. You can take another. This is just the same image, the comparison between 1972, how large Lake Chad was, and what has the economy. You can take the next one. This is the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. This was also one of the large. It's a lake. It's a huge it was a freshwater lake, and it has also shrunk to about 1/10 of its original size since 1989, 2008. One of the reasons that this has happened also is that the wrong agricultural policy during the Soviet period, because in this area there was an enormous concentration of the growing of cotton for the whole Soviet empire. Now, cotton is the most thirsty kind of plant. It consumes enormous amount of water and chemicals to be able to grow a good quality of cotton. It consumes about 4 or 5 times more than growing food, for example. So the concentration of the cotton production in that area, it drained the whole Aral Sea. Now there is no cotton production anymore. There's no water. And this, what has left, is an enormous salt lake where salt storms blow over most of Central Asia. So that's a real climate or environmental crisis and economic crisis for the whole region. You can take the next. We have another problem in the Southwest Asia. I prefer to call it Southwest Asia. We have the sand and dust storms that come visit the region 2 or 3 times a year. And this comes mostly with the northern wind, and it covers that. This is in 2000. In 2009 and 2011, there are 2 major sandstorms, and they shut down airports, ports, sometimes even schools and hospitals. They create enormous health problems for people, and this is a recurring phenomena in these desert areas. You can take the next one. And usually the storms, they start here in the north, in the border between Syria, and these are satellite images from NASA and the European Space Agency. And they usually start in the northern area. This area has gradually become less and less developed. There's very little agriculture in these areas. So the dust storms, they blow over from Syria, northern Iraq, into the south. You can take the next. This is a closer image which shows how the whole thing starts. This looks like a forest fire, but that's sand. And then it blows over Iraq. We can take the next. It continues to the Gulf, to Kuwait. You can take just next. It covers Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. It continues. And then usually it takes a loop around the highland here in central Saudi Arabia and dumps the sand in the empty quarter. And this is one of the hottest areas. It's called the empty quarter because there's almost no life or people living in that area. Let's continue to the next. And in 2011, it was so powerful, it crossed over the mountain areas in Oman and dumped the sand and dust into the Arabian Sea. You can take the next. This is also a continuation of the same all the way to Pakistan and India. This is also Afghanistan, and Iran are visited by regular sandstorms. Egypt, but this goes into the other direction. Sometimes the sandstorms, they reach all the way to Europe. Here China, Western China, is also attacked by these sandstorms. So this is a common phenomenon in all these desert regions. So if we take the Southwest Asia region, where we have the political military crisis now, we can start from there to solve the problem. So we can have a different solution for the problem than creating new wars. This is called the Fertile Crescent. There is a new item in the region. It's called the Shia Crescent, as Shia against Sunni crescent. This was an invention, a very crazy invention, that to separate the nations and into sectarian. But this is not the Shia Crescent. This is the Fertile Crescent. It's, as historians call it. This was very, I mean, agriculture started in this region. I think it's the first region in the world to start agriculture about 10,000 years ago, where you have systematic agriculture. The problem is that that region is not really so fertile anymore. And even in Syria, Syria was a very active agricultural country and was exporting wheat a few years ago. Now people are starving in Syria because of this war. Can take the next. So the idea is to, I mean, the interesting thing about these plans is it's not that something which we can do in 15, 20 years. These things can be done already. Some nations have already started working on what we call these green belts, a green belt policy to protect society and cities from sand and the expansion of the desert. These plans, they can start immediately. You know, we don't have to wait to have international agreements and so on, but the problem is that these are very local, small projects. They have very little effect on the desert. But if we take, as Tom said about protecting the planet against asteroids, we need a global effort. Many nations should be involved. And in order to deal with the desert, we also need many nations involved. But I give these examples to show you that work is already starting there, many nations, and they need support to continue that work. This is from the Iraqi Agriculture Ministry. This is a very old plan to build a green belt in the western part of the country, so at more than 1,500 kilometers, and includes also smaller green belts. This would be like 20 kilometers wide forest, planting forest to protect the cities against the desert. But of course, this has not been, it was on the drawing board for more than 40 years, but it was never implemented because Iraq was involved in wars, political upheaval, sanctions, and never managed to build this project. You see, take the next. But there are some small attempts currently in Iraq. The Iraqi government took up this project again, but it's being done in a limited. This is in Karbala, in the religious city of Karbala, in south-central Iraq, and they are building their green belt, which is only 27 kilometers to protect the city. And this is a few 100-meter deep forest where they plant olive trees, palm trees, eucalyptus trees. And so the issue is to plant the types of trees that can resist heat, they can resist the dry climate, and they are they can use less water than other types of plants, and because of their nature and character, they can be more effective as a shield against the sand and the sandstorm. So these techniques, the more development is needed in the agriculture research field to produce new types of plants, to develop new types of plants with even more resistance to heat and shortage of water. So this is what we have in Iraq. It's a small project, but it's a courageous effort given the circumstances that what is being done. You can take the next. This is also the project at the beginning. The idea to plant a variety of trees and combine it with food production, this is a very, very ancient technique. This is from the Egyptian chamber of the kings and the graves of the pharaohs of Egypt. This is about 5,000 years old. And you can see you have the type of palm trees, fruit trees, and then on top of that you have growing food, corn and so on. So these things are very old as the societies there. It gives an image of how what we do with these green belts is not only stop the desert storm. What you do if you have large-scale green belts, what you do is you change the temperature in the atmosphere locally, and you create a milder climate, and you also increase the moisture in the atmosphere. The reason there is no rain, there are two factors to create rain. One is you need moisture in the soil or in the atmosphere, and then you need cold fronts that can then condense the rain or the moisture into rain. But that is not, it's not a sustainable process in the region because there's no moisture, there is no mild climate. So by planting these green belts, you reduce the temperature. For people who live in these areas, you can see if you are inside the garden and outside the garden, the difference in temperature is enormous. It's almost 10 degrees difference. And we have Egyptian engineers, agriculture engineers, they made experiments on planting olive trees out in the open or in the shadow of palm trees. And the productivity of the olive trees who were in the shadow grew by 50% because they were not affected by the heat and the dry climate. So this is also this is an old idea. I think there's even quotes in the Quran, in the Holy Quran, about in the Al-Kahf Surah, the cave, where God gave a man a garden, 2 gardens, and these 2 gardens were shaded by palm trees, and between the palm trees you had fruit trees and other types of food. It's just a beautiful description, but this is exactly how it was in the time of the, whether the Old Testament or the, so this is a known technique. But the difference is that in the future we will not have open canals because a lot of the water goes into evaporation. We need to save water, so we will cover all the canals. We will cover all the small canals. We will use pipes instead to save water. You can take the next. The palm trees, these are very efficient, they are very tall, and they are also productive. We need not only plant green trees, we need to plant types of trees which can also give food for the population. Now there are efforts also to stop the expansion of the desert. This is from China. They use dry types of plants and other ways to create these barriers to stop the sand from drifting and moving into the other agricultural areas. This is also an old technique. Have the next. This is an image from Libya in 1950s. What is needed is not only to stop the expansion of the sand. What we need with modern technology, what we can do, we can build an infrastructure, a water infrastructure and transport infrastructure in these areas to bring water, so you can not only stop the sand, you can plant trees and move from a defensive strategy into an offensive strategy where you can take over the desert and limit it. This is from China. This is the highway in the Taklamakan desert. This is a very important highway connecting the western China to eastern China, and they dig wells. This is a bit salty water, but they plant types of plants that resist saltiness and dry climate to protect the road from the sand from encroaching on the road, which is a common problem in the Gulf, for example. So now if we go from the local to the global, what we need is, we have in this program which we are presenting, we need to use certain, and then people say, what is, how are you going to bring the water to these projects? Because there is very little water. So there are three main sources for water we can use in this program. First, we divert water from water-rich areas to water-poor areas. The second option is to create new natural resources by desalinating seawater using high energy. The third source is that we have untapped groundwater in huge quantities that are not being tapped, they are not being used. We're going to go through those, but these are some of the major projects for water diversion. Paul mentioned the Nawapa, which is our plan. If we get the Glass-Steagall and the credit system in the United States, then what we can immediately, of our friends in the United States can do immediately, is to declare that the government declares the intention of building the North American Water and Power Alliance. This was a plan which was produced by an engineering company in 1965, but before that, President Kennedy had the idea, because in the western states of the United States, which is also one of the most important agricultural areas, you have also a desert problem, you have a drought problem, and the food production is actually diminishing there. So you have had a permanent water shortage problem. The idea was to divert water from Alaska, actually, where you have the Yukon and Mackenzie rivers running. These are huge amounts of water which run into the Arctic Sea. And by building a series of dams, pumping stations, and tunnels, you can move water, like 1/5 of the water from these rivers, across the Rocky Mountains and down to the American desert and the Mexican desert. This is, the feasibility studies were done for this project. This is a gigantic project, but it's doable. What you need is to mobilize the United States exactly as the United States mobilized for Second World War. Because the United States had just come out of the Depression, but thanks to the policies of Roosevelt, rebuilt the industry. But then they converted everything. Every resource in society was used to build the logistics and machines and weapons for the American soldiers and European soldiers to fight in the Second World War. This is also a war mobilization, that the United States government and the states and everybody's mobilized to say, we're going to build this project. It will immediately create 2.5 million jobs. It will revolutionize the American economy. So this is one of the biggest water diversion projects we have in China. They are diverting now water from the Yellow River to the northern China, where also they have a drought problem, because they depend a lot on the wheat production in northern China, and they have had a drought for an extended number of years. So they have an enormous water diversion program to move big quantities of water to northern China. But this is absolutely the biggest if it's implemented. And our friends in the United States are fighting to get the states there, even Congress, to support this idea. Can take the next. We have a number of water diversion projects since many years. The most important one is to refill the Lake Chad with water from the Congo River. The Congo River is the second largest river in the world, but the water is not being used. There are no dams on the Congo River. There are plans to build ones, but because of the civil war, they're not. And the water from the Congo River flows into the Atlantic for no use. And an Italian engineering company whose head, Marcello Vichi, a friend of us who has attended many of our conferences, he was there in the region in the 1970s, and he made a feasibility study already before the crisis of the Chad Lake started, to move a certain amount, 1/5 of the water of the Congo River, from eastern Congo at the highland across the Central African Republic and down into a river which used to fill the Chad Lake, to refill the Chad Lake, and also create a transportation canal for these regions and also bring economic development. He made that feasibility study already there. He went to the jungles and with local engineers, and then he presented this to African leaders. Unfortunately, it was not implemented because with such kinds of massive development programs, you need not one nation or two, you need many nations involved, and even you need the highest levels of technological advancement, which is available in Europe and the United States. But there has been no intention to develop. Even in Europe, we have, in the United States, there are campaigns against these projects. They say they damage the local communities and the environment. So nobody wants to finance these projects from Europe or the United States. But these nations have to find a way of doing it. But anyway, the feasibility studies for that was done. We have another project, one of our Egyptian friends, an engineer called Ayman Rashid. He's having a campaign in Egypt to convince the Egyptian government to build what he calls the Africa Pass, is that to use Egypt's strategic location to open a way for the landlocked nations, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and Eastern Congo, to bring their trade and agricultural products directly to Europe on a port in the Mediterranean, in Sidi Barrani, near the border with, and to use high-speed railway also to connect Ethiopia, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and open this whole region for economic development. His idea is that you have super containers that can, instead of traveling all the way through the Suez Canal, they can dock here and build big ports and then use the high-speed rail to reach Europe in a faster, in less time. But also it's important for these nations to have a connection to Europe and to, otherwise to Asia and so on. So this project includes building a water canal to bring water from the Great Lakes and Eastern Congo through a long water canal down to Sudan, Southern Sudan, Northern Sudan, and Egypt, and refill what is called the Qattara Depression. It's a huge hole, a depression in east of Cairo, which is about 80 meters deep. It was a lake before, but he means that we should refill that and build agricultural projects. His idea is to build new cities, industrial centers, parallel to the Nile Valley. Now we have one ironical situation. People say there's a population explosion in Egypt. You know, you have 80 million people of Egypt living on only 5% of the land. So the problem is not the population. The problem is the distribution of the population. So 95% of the land of Egypt is not used. So there is no population crisis in Egypt. The problem is that there is no housing, there are no cities being built. And our friend Ayman, he says we can build 10 new cities with about 2 million people just to start with in these regions and bring water. All this land can be utilized, even Sudan. I mean, Sudan was called the potential breadbasket of the world. The land there is so fertile. You just bring some water and you can grow anything you want. The problem is that the intention has not been to use Sudan for agriculture. So these things can revolutionize both the economy for the population, but also the relations among these nations by creating a certain kind of dependence among these nations where you cannot sabotage your neighbor because you will be killed economically if you don't cooperate with your neighbors. So this is the kind of transnational projects, and of course all these projects should be built and decided by sovereign nation states, not by any IMF or World Bank or UN or other overnational. These organizations can be discussion forums for sovereign nations, but they should not dictate the policy for sovereign nations. These nations have decided themselves that they want to enter this kind of agreement. You can take the next. Yeah, this is an animation of how, if these plans are implemented, both the water and transport plans, you click on the image itself. A 50-year perspective, this is what these are the railway lines we propose to connect Africa. Africa is not connected at all with each other with a modern railway. And then we are talking about using small-scale nuclear power plants to desalinate water and produce energy for the industrialization of Africa. Yeah, other massive water diversion programs. This is something which is as old as the Stalin. You know, in the 1930s, the idea was to move water from the Ob and Irtysh River, building a dam and then a long canal to bring water to the Aral Sea area, which I showed was drying up, but it was part of the Soviet plan. It doesn't matter if it's called Soviet plan. It was a sound economic policy, and these nations need it today. The other idea is to bring from the other side of the Ural Mountains, from the Pechora River, which also flows into the Arctic Sea, to divert a part of that water into the Volga River and bring water to the same region or to the eastern Caspian Sea. So these are big projects, international organizations, and they don't like big projects. They say these are just romantic stuff that never can be done. The reason it was never been done is that there was nobody worked to build them, because these are completely feasible. These can be done. It's no problem. We have the technology to build these dams, these projects. Another interesting project which Iranian engineers have been envisioning themselves about 40 years is to bring water to the desert in Iran. You have two major deserts in Iran, Dashti Kavir and Dashti Lut. And these are very, very dry areas. They're also combined with social and political problems in this region, which is adjacent to Afghanistan. The Iranians have been very active to, like the Chinese, to build the Silk Road, the connection between Asia and Europe. And they actually finished in 1996, the same year I mentioned the Silk Road policy was introduced. They built a little connection here to Sarakhs in Turkmenistan, and that way they made the connection all the way to Western China. Now, the Iranians are also working on building a connection which the Indians are interested in from the Shah Bahar in southern Iran. This railway is completed now, and there's a massive port which India and other nations in Asia can use for transporting goods to Russia, Central Asia, and Europe. It reduces the traveling time, comparing to with ships through the Suez Canal and Mediterranean. It takes about 3 weeks. With railways, it takes only 1 week to bring goods at the same distance. So this is becoming a vital economic development region. What you need is you need to bring even water. So the idea is to build a canal to fill these lowlands, desert lands with water, creating some lakes, and a navigation canal. These are going to be big challenges, of course, to do. But the Iranian government, we heard that we had the Iranian ambassador in our conference in November, the Iranian ambassador in Berlin. He said there is a feasibility study being undertaken. What has been done is last year, the Iranian president, he inaugurated a project not to build a canal, but to build a desalination plant to desalinate seawater using gas, natural gas, to desalinate water and bring it to these cities. These are less amounts of water, but are crucial for this dry region. What the impact is, you create a totally new climate, a milder climate in this whole region. You can also build desalination plants along the canal. It will affect this whole region, including Afghanistan. Iran, I mean, the only countries who are investing in Afghanistan are not the NATO countries. It's China and Iran are investing in economic projects in Afghanistan. For the Chinese, Afghanistan is going to be a very important raw materials producer in the future. Some of the largest copper and lithium mines exist in Afghanistan, but they're not being developed. So the Chinese are going in, investing tens of billions of dollars in the mining industry, but at the same time, they are building water dams, railways, roads, and so on for the Afghani government. It's a kind of fair trade, doing business. Iran is also developing this region, which is Iran's sphere of influence in Herat, by building a railway, roads, and having trade with these regions. One important thing is, of course, for Afghanistan is we have the enormous problem with the opium. Since the invasion of Afghanistan, or the war in Afghanistan, and the United States and Britain went in, and later NATO troops, the opium production in Afghanistan had increased 8 times since it was the year 2000. And that opium is being used, I mean, Afghanistan is the biggest producer of opium, but also of heroin. And people in statistics in Russia, thousands of people die in Russia because of heroin addiction. This is equal to a war. I mean, you can't kill thousands of people without firing a shot from Afghanistan in Russia or even in Europe. And this creates enormous problems, social and economic problems for people all over the place. Even in Iran is affected by the opium trade. So one idea is to convert the opium trade into different kinds to produce food for the Afghani people. I mean, Afghanistan was the garden. Even Iranian kings, they used to have their summer vacation in Afghanistan because it was so lush and they had so much agriculture, and so it was like a resort for the Iranian kings in Afghanistan. Now Afghanistan is a dry country. It's a terrible mess. But these kind of things can change the situation there for the population and create, you know, a totally different idea of what the society is about. We have enormous religious fanaticism taking over. But if you bring economic development and you start thinking about developing society and the future generations, you change the mentality of the people too. So this is one of the other water diversion. We have in Turkey have been building enormous water projects, dams in the southeastern Anatolian area. It's called GAP in Turkish. There is, I mean, their idea is to take this region, it's the Kurdish region, of course, which is have tension the whole time, and turn it into one of the most productive agricultural regions, using the water from the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, there are problems with these projects because the water, which is have been after the building of the big dams like the Ataturk Dam, you can have an image, is that this is one of the biggest dams in the region. This is the Ataturk Dam, and it produces about 4,000 megawatts of electricity. This whole region around these dam projects has been transformed actually to become one of the most productive agricultural regions for Turkey. Now, one big problem with that, with their policy, is that they are concentrating on the production of cash crops, but also on cotton. Turkey is one of the big exporters of garments and textiles, but they are focusing too much on the production of cotton, which, as I said, consumes very big amounts of water compared to production of food. So that is also going to be a problem, and also the impact it creates on the downstream countries like Syria and Iraq is that the water in the Tigris and Euphrates have been diminishing there, creating big crisis for Iraq and Syria. So it's not wrong to build these kinds of projects, but the important thing is that you have to have a rational policy on how you manage the water. So these kinds of projects are necessary. So if you go to the next one, we had, as part of the, when the peace process started between the Palestinians and Israelis in Oslo '93, some of the old ideas, like this old idea to build a peace pipeline, it was later called, to bring water from these other rivers in western Turkey by pipeline to the Gulf countries through Syria, Jordan. The Turks thought about this as a trade. You know, they can trade water for oil or whatever. It's a commercial project, but in light of our idea of peace through economic development, these kind of projects will help ease tension among nations, but also solve this problem with the water shortage. I can take the next one. Take the next one also. We had Mr. LaRouche proposed since the 1970s been fighting for an idea which he calls the Oasis Plan. He said that the conflict between Israel and the Arabs will never be resolved by political means only, unless you start creating an economic cooperation plan for all these nations, which is supported by the United States and Europe, to develop these nations and show these nations that peace actually is for the benefit of everyone. Then you will not have peace. This will be destroyed. The peace process, the Oslo peace process, will be destroyed by the guns of the extremists on both sides. And unfortunately, that's what has happened. The Oslo peace process, the peace process is completely dead right now. Nothing is moving there. So this idea for Mr. LaRouche said, we have to start immediately before we finish the negotiations to help Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians to build a number of water projects. This is the Red Sea, Dead Sea, and Mediterranean water canal projects to use the low point for of the Dead Sea to bring water from the higher altitude from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and using the flow of water downward to generate electricity and desalinate seawater. The Jordanians are trying to get funding for this project, but it's not going anywhere. The other idea is to use small-scale nuclear power plants, high-temperature nuclear power plants, to desalinate seawater. That's what we say is the other source of water, because in these regions it's difficult to bring water from somewhere else. It's surrounded by sea, but the water is salty. You need to take the salt out. You need high temperature or electric power to use the reverse osmosis process to take the salt off the water. And one model is, we have already the previous one. This is a model of a Russian floating nuclear power plant. These are small scale, maybe 100, 200 megawatt. The Russians, I think they inaugurated the first one in the Arctic Sea region, in Siberian, these small towns, which is difficult for the electric grid to reach. The idea is to build local electricity production plants, and this is one image. It's almost like a ship, and it could be produced in a serial manner in any port, and then taken to that region for the production of electricity and heat and so on. So you can have developing societies even in very remote areas. So the idea is to do the same thing in the Arab countries, Israel, in the Gulf. In the countries in the Gulf, like the United Arab Emirates, they are constructing 4 major nuclear power plants with the help of South Korea. Saudi Arabia has plans to build, they say, 60 nuclear power plants. It's difficult to envision that right away, but if they start with a few ones immediately, they will give a good sign that they are intending. Iran has already an operating nuclear power plant. So I think this is for the future. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, they produce 2/3 of all the fresh water by desalination in the world, because most of the drinking water in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf comes from desalinating seawater. Even the groundwater is not good enough for drinking. But the problem is that they are using natural gas and oil to desalinate the seawater. And in Saudi Arabia, they use about 1.5 million barrels every day to produce the water. So in the future, this is not going to be feasible, because if the needs increase by 2 or 3 times, you will need to burn 5-6 million barrels of oil every day just to produce water. So the only solution, even the International Atomic Energy Agency says the best efficient solution for that is to use nuclear power to desalinate the seawater. The other source of water is we have groundwater. There are campaigns internationally by environmentalist movements, even some of the UN organizations. They say you should not draw too much of the groundwater because you deplete that groundwater and you create a crisis, which is true. We have a crisis in Gaza right now. The United Nations says in 2020, Gaza will not be livable. No human being can live in Gaza because the groundwater has been depleted and contaminated by seawater because they're pulling out too much water. The problem with that theory is that it's only half of the story, because the theory of groundwater is that you have rain in the highland or in other regions, and then that rain flows, the runoff, into the rivers and the sea, but part of the water goes into the sedimentary area and creates small aquifers. So, and that water is being refilled with the help of rain, you know, every year and so on. But this is a limited amount of water. This is what they're talking about. Now, there are scientists who say there's a different type of groundwater. If you take the next image. No, you went to, yeah. Is that in addition to this shallow groundwater, there's another theory that says that actually water and, you know, melting snow water can reach much deeper areas and create other types of aquifers which are rechargeable. They can be refilled the whole time. And that could be used in Africa. We have in Darfur, we have a huge water reservoir, we have in southern Egypt. And this is another source of water which we can use. So we have resources available for us today to start this greening the desert project, and we don't need to wait. The only problem we have is that we don't have a policy, international policy, to say this is what we're going to do. In order to solve the problem with terrorism and religious extremists and so on, what we need is not to support one group against the other or have regime change. What we need is to start building these types of projects. So I think if we just, we don't have to go through everything because I think we are running out of time. Just go quickly.
Okay.
So my point is that this is completely feasible. It can be done any moment. Exactly as a war can start tomorrow, we can start working on these projects tomorrow too. And there are people in place in all these countries who are waiting for support to start implementing these projects. We're getting in contact with all kinds of engineers, young people who say, I have an idea for my country, I have an idea for this region, we can do this, we can do that, but there is no government policy to start these projects. They just remain on Facebook or some other website, but governments are not taking these things seriously. So that has a change in the attitude has to come forward. But as Tom said, we create a paradigm shift in the policy in the United States and Europe, and that will send shockwaves all around the world.